There is a moment, quiet, often unannounced, when something inside you shifts so subtly that it feels like nothing at all, and yet afterward, nothing is ever the same. It does not arrive with thunder or revelation in the cinematic sense. It arrives like a pause between breaths, like the instant you realize the night sky is not a ceiling but a depth. The moment you realize this, reality can no longer control you, because what you have recognized is not a trick, nor an escape, nor a denial of the world, but the architecture beneath it. You begin to sense that what you once believed to be solid, immovable, and authoritative is in fact provisional, negotiated, and strangely responsive to the way you look at it. Most of us grow up believing reality is something that happens to us. It is framed as a force, a set of rules enforced by gravity, time, money, language, and expectation. We are taught to adapt to it, survive within it, compete inside it. Reality is portrayed as a final authority, a judge that hands down verdicts we must accept. But beneath this inherited understanding lies a deeper truth, one that civilizations have circled for thousands of years using myth, meditation, mathematics, and mysticism. Reality is not merely an external structure. It is also a relationship. And relationships, once understood, lose their power to dominate. The moment you realize this, you feel something loosen in your chest. The world does not disappear. Bills still arrive. Bodies still age. Time still moves. Yet something fundamental has changed. Reality no longer feels like a prison, it begins to feel like an interface. You see that what you experience as the world is filtered through perception, interpretation, memory, and meaning. You notice how two people can stand in the same storm and live in entirely different worlds. You start to wonder whether the bars you've been pressing against were ever locked at all. This realization often begins at the edge of discomfort. It may emerge after loss, when the structures you relied upon fail to hold. It may arise in moments of stillness, when the noise quiets enough for something truer to speak. Or it may surface during awe, watching waves erase footprints, staring into the vast indifference of stars, or feeling time dissolve in deep creative focus. In these moments, you sense that reality is not simply happening, but being interpreted, and that interpretation is not passive. It is participatory. There is something almost cosmic about this shift, because it echoes the way modern physics describes the universe. At the smallest scales, particles behave differently depending on how they are observed. Measurement changes outcomes. Certainty dissolves into probability. The universe itself seems less like a machine and more like a question responding to inquiry. When this scientific insight meets inner awareness, it produces a quiet revolution. If observation shapes reality at the quantum level, what might awareness shape at the human level? Yet this is not an invitation to fantasy or denial. The moment you realize this is not the moment you pretend the world is anything you want it to be. It is the moment you understand that reality is layered. There is the surface layer of events, conditions, and circumstances, and beneath it, a deeper layer of meaning, choice, and response. Control dissolves not because the world obeys you, but because you no longer mistake its surface movements for ultimate authority. You stop confusing the map for the territory, the echo for the voice, the shadow for the source. In this space, a different kind of freedom becomes possible. Not the loud, performative freedom of rebellion, but the quiet, unshakable freedom of clarity. You realize that much of what once constrained you, fear, shame, urgency, comparison, was never enforced by reality itself, but by unconscious agreements you made with interpretations that went unquestioned. When those agreements are seen clearly, they lose their binding power. Reality does not need to be fought, it needs to be understood. This understanding does not arrive all at once. It unfolds like dawn, gradually illuminating what was always there. You begin to notice how language shapes experience, how stories frame suffering, how attention feeds certain outcomes while starving others. You see how identities are constructed, how roles are inherited, how beliefs are reinforced by repetition rather than truth. And in seeing these things, you are no longer fully inside them. You gain what might be called existential leverage, the ability to stand slightly apart from the currents that once swept you along unquestioned. The phrase, reality can no longer control you, does not mean you become untouchable. Pain still hurts. Loss still matters. Consequences still exist. But control is different from influence. Control implies domination without consent. What dissolves in this realization is the unconscious surrender of authorship. You reclaim the ability to choose your orientation toward what happens, and that choice quietly reshapes everything. Reality becomes something you engage with, not something that defines you. There is an ancient familiarity to this insight. Mystics spoke of it as awakening. Philosophers described it as stepping out of the cave. Psychologists hint at it when they speak of metacognition and narrative selfhood. Artists touch it when they lose themselves in creation. Each tradition points toward the same threshold, the moment you see the mechanism by which reality appears solid, and realize that solidity is, in part, a shared hallucination stabilized by belief and habit. Standing at this threshold, you do not escape the world, you enter it more fully. You begin to sense the hidden architecture beneath appearances, the invisible agreements that hold societies together, the subtle feedback loop between inner state and outer experience. And once you see the loop, you are no longer trapped inside it. You can step in and out, engage consciously, respond rather than react. Reality, once a master, becomes a collaborator. This is the doorway this exploration opens. Not toward detachment from life, but toward a deeper participation in it. The moment you realize this is not an ending, it is a beginning, a reorientation of perception that changes how every moment is met. From here, the question is no longer, what is reality doing to me, but, how am I meeting what is happening, and who am I becoming in that meeting? Once you step past the threshold of that first realization, the world does not suddenly rearrange itself, but your way of seeing begins to deepen, as though you have discovered a second set of eyes behind your own. The moment you realize this, reality can no longer control you because you begin to recognize its underlying mechanics. What once felt like an opaque force reveals patterns, tendencies, and habits, subtle, repeating motions that shape experience without ever announcing themselves. You start to sense that reality is less like a wall and more like a current, and currents only overpower those who mistake them for fixed ground. One of the first themes that emerges is the distinction between appearance and structure. Reality presents itself as a continuous stream of events, identities, and outcomes, but beneath that stream lies an organizing logic composed of beliefs, expectations, and attention. What you experience is not merely what happens, but what is filtered, emphasized, and interpreted by the mind. Two people can encounter the same event and walk away with entirely different realities, not because the event changed, but because meaning did. When this becomes clear, control loosens. You realize that much of what governs your emotional and psychological life is not the event itself, but the invisible lens through which it passes. Closely intertwined with this is the theme of illusion, not illusion as deception, but illusion as assumption. Many of the structures that feel most binding are rarely examined. Time feels scarce because we are taught to experience it that way. Identity feels fixed because we rehearse it daily. Limitations feel real because they are named, repeated, and socially reinforced. The moment you realize this, you begin to see how reality is stabilized through consensus. What is often persists because many people agree not to question it. This does not make reality false, but it makes it conditional. And conditional things do not have absolute power. Another core concept is the role of attention as a shaping force. Attention is not neutral, it is creative. What you dwell on expands, not because the universe is rewarding or punishing you, but because attention feeds perception, perception feeds interpretation, and interpretation feeds action. This loop operates constantly, quietly constructing what feels like an objective world. When you become aware of this loop, you are no longer fully inside it. You can redirect attention, soften fixation, and interrupt cycles that once felt inevitable. Reality's grip weakens not through resistance, but through awareness. At the center of these themes is the understanding that the self you thought was experiencing reality is itself part of the construction. The sense of a me that feels solid and continuous is woven from memory, language, and narrative. It is a useful structure, but not an absolute one. When you see this, identity loosens. You are no longer entirely defined by your past, your role, or your self-description. Reality loses control because it no longer has a single, rigid point to press against. Flexibility enters where certainty once ruled. There is also a deeper, almost paradoxical concept at work: surrender and agency are not opposites. The moment you realize this, you stop trying to dominate reality and stop allowing it to dominate you. You meet it instead. You allow events to unfold without adding unnecessary resistance, while retaining the freedom to choose your response. This is not passivity, it is precision. Like a skilled sailor, you do not command the wind, but you understand how to set the sails. Reality becomes navigable rather than oppressive. Another pillar of this realization is impermanence, not as a bleak truth, but as a liberating one. When you truly see that everything arising will pass, control dissolves at both extremes. Fear loses its permanence, and success loses its intoxicating grip. You no longer cling as tightly, nor do you push away as desperately. Reality stops controlling you because it no longer threatens to define you forever. Each moment becomes a visitor rather than a verdict. Underlying all these concepts is a quiet but radical shift in orientation. Instead of asking how to control reality, you begin asking how reality is constructed within experience. This question changes everything. It invites curiosity instead of fear, observation instead of judgment. You begin to notice how moods color perception, how expectations script interactions before they occur, how deeply inherited beliefs masquerade as facts. In noticing, you gain space. In space, you gain choice. There is also an ethical dimension to this realization. When you see that reality is shaped through perception and response, responsibility returns, not as blame, but as authorship. You recognize the power of your inner stance, the ripple effects of your interpretations, the way unexamined assumptions quietly reproduce suffering. Reality no longer controls you because you are no longer asleep inside it. You are awake enough to participate consciously. These themes do not demand withdrawal from the world. They invite deeper engagement. Relationships become less about control and more about resonance. Work becomes less about survival and more about expression. Challenges become less about punishment and more about information. Reality, once perceived as an external tyrant, reveals itself as a dynamic field of interaction, constantly responding to how it is met. As these core concepts interweave, a new understanding takes shape. Reality does not lose its weight or texture, but it loses its authority to dictate who you are. You stand within it rather than beneath it. The moment you realize this, you stop being controlled not because you escape the world, but because you finally understand how deeply you are already part of its unfolding. Long before these realizations are named, they are lived through story. Not the kind printed neatly in books, but the kind embedded in myths, dreams, and the half-remembered images that surface when logic loosens its grip. The moment you realize this, reality can no longer control you because you begin to hear the symbolic language beneath events, as though the world has been speaking in metaphors all along, waiting for you to learn how to listen. There is an old story, told in many forms, of a traveler lost in a dense forest. The trees are tall, their canopies overlapping, blotting out the sky. Paths twist back on themselves. Every direction feels the same. The traveler panics, believing the forest is an enemy, an obstacle designed to trap them. They run, exhaust themselves, curse the terrain. Only when they stop, when they finally sit against a tree and allow their breath to settle, do they notice something subtle. The forest is not moving. It is not chasing them. The confusion arose not from the forest's nature, but from the traveler's frantic movement within it. When they climb a small rise and glimpse the horizon, orientation returns. The forest does not disappear, but it loses its power to terrify. Reality functions much the same way. When you are caught in motion, reacting, resisting, striving, you experience it as controlling. Symbolically, the forest is life, and the traveler is the unexamined self. The moment you realize this, you gain altitude, not by escaping the forest, but by seeing its shape. Perspective becomes liberation. Another symbolic narrative appears in the image of a mirror. Imagine a hall filled with mirrors of varying clarity. Some are warped, some cracked, some clouded by age. A person walks through this hall, believing each reflection to be an external judgment. One mirror shows them smaller, another distorted, another broken. They respond emotionally to each image, changing posture, shrinking or posturing defensively. Only when they encounter a clear mirror do they realize what has been happening. The mirrors were never commenting on their worth. They were merely reflecting, each according to its condition. In that moment, the power of the reflections collapses. The person stops adjusting themselves to every image. They stand as they are. This hall of mirrors is perception itself. Culture, family, memory, trauma, all of them are reflective surfaces through which reality appears. When you mistake reflection for truth, reality controls you through distortion. When you realize the reflective nature of experience, you stop contorting yourself to match every image. You become less reactive, less governed by appearances. Reality loses its leverage. There is also the ancient symbol of the mask. In many traditions, masks were not used to deceive, but to reveal, to allow forces, archetypes, or truths to speak through a human face. Yet over time, the wearer forgets the mask is removable. They begin to believe the mask is the face. Roles harden into identities. The worker, the parent, the success, the failure, all become fused with the self. Reality controls through these masks because it speaks to them directly, bypassing the deeper being underneath. The moment you realize this, you feel the edges of the mask. You sense space between who you are and what you perform. This does not mean you abandon roles, it means you inhabit them lightly. You wear them rather than become them. Symbolically, this is the difference between an actor lost in character and an actor who knows the stage. The latter feels the floor beneath their feet even while speaking the lines. Reality cannot control what it cannot fully define. One of the most enduring symbolic narratives is that of the river. Life is often described as a current, carrying people along whether they consent or not. Those who fight the river exhaust themselves. Those who surrender entirely may drift aimlessly. But there is a third way, symbolized by the swimmer who understands the river's flow. They feel the current, respect its force, and move with intention within it. They cross when needed, float when wise, and rest at the banks when tired. By the time you arrive here, something subtle has already happened. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they point toward. The moment you realize this, reality can no longer control you, not because reality has vanished, softened, or become obedient, but because you are no longer asleep inside it. You are standing awake within the unfolding, aware of both the stage and your place upon it, feeling the ground beneath your feet without mistaking it for the limits of the sky. All the threads we have followed converge here. The insight that reality is layered, not monolithic. The recognition that perception, attention, and interpretation quietly shape experience. The symbolic understanding that life speaks in patterns rather than commands. The practical integration that allows you to move through ordinary days with less friction and more presence. Together, they form not a doctrine, but a stance. A way of standing in the world that does not require certainty, control, or constant defense. At this point, it becomes clear that the deepest form of freedom is not escape. It is intimacy without entanglement. You are fully here, engaged, responsive, caring, without being consumed by the illusion that circumstances define your worth or dictate your inner state. Reality still surprises you. It still challenges you. But it no longer owns you. You have reclaimed the authorship that was never truly taken, only forgotten. This realization carries a quiet responsibility. When you see that much of reality's control was sustained by unconscious participation, you also see your role in what continues. You notice how easily old habits reassert themselves, how quickly identity tries to harden again, how seductive certainty can be. Awakening is not a permanent achievement, it is a recurring choice. A practice of remembering rather than a state of arrival. And yet, this is not fragile. What you have seen cannot be unseen. Even when you forget, something in you knows that forgetting is happening. That alone changes everything. You recover more quickly. You soften sooner. You return with less drama and more humility. Reality's attempts to reclaim control feel increasingly transparent, like staged tricks you once believed in but now recognize for what they are. The transformational call here is not to withdraw from life, but to meet it more honestly. To notice when you are reacting instead of responding. To feel when fear is narrating the moment rather than informing it. To sense when you are tightening against uncertainty instead of moving with it. Each time you notice, you step back into authorship. Each time you choose awareness over reflex, reality loosens its grip a little more. This way of living does not make you immune to pain, but it makes pain workable. It does not eliminate loss, but it prevents loss from becoming identity. It does not guarantee peace, but it reveals that peace was never dependent on perfect conditions. It lived, quietly, in the space between stimulus and story, waiting to be noticed. Perhaps the most profound shift is this: you stop asking life to make sense before you live it. You live it, and meaning emerges through engagement. You trust that clarity arises through participation, not through control. You allow yourself to be changed by experience without being erased by it. Reality becomes a teacher rather than a tyrant, a mirror rather than a verdict. As you move forward, the world will continue to test this understanding. Old structures will reappear. New challenges will arise. Moments of forgetting will come, and with them, familiar feelings of being trapped, rushed, or defined. When they do, remember this moment, not as a memory, but as a recognition. The recognition that control was never absolute. That freedom was never elsewhere. That you are not what is happening, but the one who is aware of it happening. This is not an ending. It is a quiet beginning that unfolds endlessly. Each moment offers the same invitation, to meet reality as it is, without surrendering your inner authorship to it. To stand awake inside the world, neither above it nor beneath it, but in conscious relationship with its unfolding. And in that standing, in that simple, profound shift, the moment you realize this continues to echo, gently and persistently, until reality can no longer control you at all. This swimmer represents the state beyond control. Reality still flows. Circumstances still arise. But understanding replaces panic. The swimmer is not dominated by the river because they are no longer separate from it. They are in relationship with it. The moment you realize this, struggle transforms into dialogue. Dreams often carry this same symbolism. Falling dreams, for instance, are rarely about danger. They are about release. The fear comes from the belief that falling means loss of control. But those who learn to let go within the dream often discover they can float, fly, or land gently. The dream teaches what waking life resists: control is not always safety, and surrender is not always defeat. Reality loses its power when you stop clenching against it. Even the symbol of death, so often feared, plays a role here. In myth, death is rarely an ending alone, it is a passage, a transformation, a shedding of form. When you see this symbolically, you realize that many deaths happen while living, identities dissolve, beliefs collapse, certainties vanish. Each one feels catastrophic until you recognize its function. Something false is being released. Reality controls through fear of endings. When endings are seen as thresholds, fear loosens its grip. All these narratives point toward the same hidden message: reality is not merely happening, it is communicating. It speaks in symbols, patterns, and repetitions, inviting interpretation rather than submission. The moment you realize this, you stop asking why reality is against you and begin asking what it is showing you. Control dissolves into conversation. In this symbolic understanding, you are no longer a victim of the story. You become a reader, and eventually, a co-author. Reality still provides the setting, the weather, the unexpected plot twists. But meaning becomes something you participate in. And once meaning is reclaimed, control no longer resides solely outside you. After symbolism has done its quiet work and insight has loosened the grip of old assumptions, a natural question arises, not loudly but persistently: how does this way of seeing live inside ordinary days? The moment you realize this, reality can no longer control you, but it will still meet you every morning in traffic, conversations, responsibilities, and unexpected disruptions. Integration is where understanding stops being an inner revelation and becomes a lived orientation, something felt in posture, tone, timing, and response. In daily life, this realization first shows itself in how you meet difficulty. When challenges arise, there is often a brief pause where a choice becomes visible. Instead of immediately collapsing into the story that this moment is unfair, threatening, or defining, you notice the urge to interpret before you obey it. This noticing creates space. In that space, reality loses its ability to dictate your inner state. You still address the problem, but you do so without the added weight of self-judgment or catastrophic meaning. Stress becomes information rather than identity. This shift subtly transforms work. Tasks once experienced as pressure begin to feel more like movement within a larger pattern. You notice how much suffering came not from effort itself, but from the belief that effort was proof of inadequacy or danger. When that belief loosens, work becomes cleaner. Focus improves. Creativity emerges where anxiety once crowded the field. Reality no longer controls through urgency because urgency is revealed as a mental amplification rather than a fact. Relationships, too, change their texture. When you see that reality is filtered through perception, you become less reactive to others' behavior. Words are heard more clearly, without immediately being translated into threat or validation. You notice how often conflict arose not from what was said, but from the meaning assigned to it. With awareness, that assignment becomes optional. You listen more fully. You respond rather than defend. Reality loses control because emotional reflexes are no longer automatic. Even decision-making softens. Choices once haunted by fear of getting life wrong begin to feel more experimental, more alive. You recognize that no single decision carries the total weight of your existence. Paths unfold through iteration, not perfection. When you internalize impermanence, mistakes lose their power to paralyze. Reality no longer controls through imagined futures because you are anchored in presence, adjusting as you go. The body reflects this integration as well. Tension decreases not because life becomes easier, but because resistance decreases. You notice how much physical tightness was a response to mental narratives rather than actual danger. Breath deepens. Movements become more fluid. The nervous system learns, slowly, that not every stimulus requires alarm. Reality cannot control a body that no longer treats every moment as a threat. This does not mean disengagement from injustice, responsibility, or ambition. It means engagement without collapse. When reality is no longer perceived as an absolute authority, you can act with clarity rather than compulsion. You advocate, build, and contribute not from fear of being erased, but from alignment with what matters. Action becomes cleaner, more sustainable. Burnout loses its inevitability. One of the most practical implications of this realization is the changing relationship with thought. Thoughts are no longer mistaken for commands or prophecies. They are seen as weather patterns moving through awareness. Some bring rain, some bring light, none need to be fought. When thoughts lose their authority, reality loses one of its main control mechanisms. Inner dialogue becomes guidance rather than governance. Time, too, shifts its character. You still plan, remember, and anticipate, but time no longer feels like a predator. Moments are inhabited more fully. You notice how often control was exerted through the feeling of being late, behind, or running out. When presence deepens, time becomes a medium rather than a threat. Reality stops rushing you when you stop believing you are always about to miss something essential. In practical terms, this realization invites a gentler discipline. Reflection becomes a habit. You check in with your interpretations before acting on them. You ask whether a reaction is arising from reality itself or from a story layered on top of it. This questioning does not slow life, it refines it. You waste less energy fighting phantoms. Reality loses control because clarity replaces compulsion. Over time, a quiet confidence develops, not the confidence of dominance, but of orientation. You trust your ability to meet what arises. You know that even when circumstances are difficult, your relationship to them remains flexible. This trust is deeply practical. It affects how you speak, how you listen, how you rest. It allows you to navigate uncertainty without demanding guarantees. Integration is not about maintaining a constant state of insight. It is about returning, again and again, to the recognition that you are not identical to what is happening. You are the one meeting it. In that meeting, freedom quietly lives. Reality still provides the terrain, but you choose how to walk it.